the summer of 1884, a decision was made in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that would shock the civilized world and change maritime law forever. 4 men were adrift in a small lifeboat, dying of thirst and starvation. One of them was just 17 years old, an orphan boy on his first real job at sea. What happened next would divide public opinion, challenge the very foundations of morality, and create a legal precedent that still influences courts today. This is the true story of Richard Parker, the boy whose tragic fate became one of the most controversial cases in legal history. What you're about to hear will make you question what you would do when faced with the ultimate choice between survival and humanity. Richard Parker was born into poverty in the bustling port city of Southampton in 1867. His childhood was marked by the kind of hardship that was all too common in Victorian England. His parents died when he was barely old enough to remember their faces, leaving him to navigate the harsh realities of life as an orphan in one of England's busiest maritime centers. Southampton in the 1880s was a city that lived and breathed by the rhythm of the sea. The docks were constantly alive with activity. Merchant vessels loading cargo bound for distant colonies, passenger ships preparing for transatlantic crossings, and fishing boats returning with their daily catch. For a boy like Richard, who had no family and no inheritance, the docks represented both opportunity and danger. From the age of 12, Richard worked whatever jobs he could find around the harbor. He carried messages between ships, helped load cargo, cleaned vessels, and did any task that would earn him a few pennies to buy bread. The other dock workers remember him as a small, wiry boy with bright eyes and an eagerness to learn. Despite his circumstances, Richard maintained an optimistic spirit that impressed the seasoned sailors who worked alongside him. The maritime community of Southampton was tight-knit, and word traveled fast about young Richard's reliability and work ethic. He never complained about the long hours or dangerous conditions. He never stole, even when he was hungry. Most importantly, he showed genuine interest in seamanship, watching carefully as experienced sailors worked, asking questions, and dreaming of the day when he might sail beyond the horizon himself. By 1884, when Richard was 17, he had grown into a capable young man. He was still small in stature, weighing perhaps 130 pounds, but he was strong from years of physical labor. His hands were calloused from handling ropes and cargo, and his skin was weathered from constant exposure to salt air and sun. More importantly, he had learned enough about ships and sailing to be considered for his first real position as a crew member. The opportunity came in the form of the Mignonette, a 52-foot yacht that needed a cabin boy for a delivery voyage to Australia. The position offered real wages, not just the odd coins he earned around the docks. For Richard, this represented everything he had worked toward. A chance to prove himself as a real sailor and perhaps build a career at sea. The job was offered by Tom Dudley, an experienced captain who had heard good things about Richard's character and work ethic. Dudley was impressed by the young man's enthusiasm and his willingness to learn. Edwin Stevens, who would serve as mate, also approved of the choice. The third crew member, Edmund Brooks, was the experienced seaman who would handle navigation duties. Richard spent his last days in Southampton preparing for the voyage with an excitement that was infectious to those around him. He purchased his first real sea kit, a few changes of clothes, basic toiletries, and the essential tools of a sailor. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere, that he had found his calling. Friends at the docks threw him a small farewell party at a local tavern, where the older sailors shared stories of their adventures and offered advice for his first major voyage. Richard listened with wide eyes, absorbing every detail about life at sea. He spoke excitedly about seeing new places, learning navigation, and perhaps one day commanding his own vessel. On the morning of May 19, 1884, Richard Parker walked down to the docks with his simple sea bag slung over his shoulder, ready to begin what he believed would be the adventure of a lifetime. He had no way of knowing that he would never see Southampton again, or that his name would become synonymous with one of the most horrific decisions ever made at sea. The Mignonette was an elegant yacht, built for wealthy clients who wanted to explore distant shores in comfort and style. She was being delivered to her new owner in Sydney, Australia, a routine delivery voyage that should have taken several weeks of pleasant sailing through the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope. For Richard Parker, Stepping aboard represented the fulfillment of years of dreams about life at sea. Captain Tom Dudley was 40 years old, an experienced mariner who had commanded vessels for over 2 decades. He was known as a competent sailor and a fair leader, though some who knew him described him as perhaps too willing to take risks for profit. Edwin Stevens, 37, served as mate and had sailed with Dudley on previous voyages. Edmund Brooks, 38, was the most experienced navigator aboard and had spent most of his adult life at sea. The crew got along well during the early days of the voyage. Richard proved to be an enthusiastic and capable cabin boy, eager to learn every aspect of seamanship. He took pride in keeping the yacht clean and organized, serving meals, and helping with sail handling. The older men appreciated his positive attitude and willingness to take on any task without complaint. For the first month, the voyage proceeded exactly as planned. The Mignonette sailed south along the African coast, making good time in favorable winds. Richard spent his off-duty hours learning navigation from Brooks, studying charts, and absorbing the wisdom of his more experienced crewmates. He wrote letters to friends back in Southampton, describing the wonders of the ocean and his excitement about reaching Australia. But as they sailed deeper into the South Atlantic, the weather began to deteriorate. Storm systems that had been distant threats gradually closed in around them. By early July, they were encountering increasingly severe conditions, high winds, massive waves, and the kind of weather that tests both ship and crew to their limits. On July 5, 1884, approximately 1,300 miles from the Cape of Good Hope, the Mignonette encountered a storm that would change everything. The wind had been building throughout the day, and by evening, mountainous waves were crashing over the yacht's deck. Captain Dudley ordered all hands to secure everything possible and prepare for what was clearly going to be a brutal night. Richard had never experienced anything like the violence of that storm. The yacht was thrown around like a toy, climbing massive waves only to crash down into the troughs with bone-jarring impacts. Water poured over the deck continuously, and the crew had to work frantically to keep the vessel from being overwhelmed. For hours, they battled the elements, taking turns at the helm and working the pumps to keep the yacht afloat. But the Mignonette, elegant as she was, had not been built for such extreme conditions. Around midnight, a particularly massive wave struck the yacht with devastating force. There was a sickening crack as the hull split, and water began pouring into the cabin spaces faster than the pumps could handle it. Captain Dudley immediately recognized that the yacht was doomed. He ordered the crew to launch the lifeboat, a 13-foot dinghy that was their only hope of survival. In the chaos of the sinking, they managed to grab only the most essential supplies: 2 tins of turnips, no fresh water, and virtually no other provisions. The 4 men barely escaped with their lives as the Mignonette disappeared beneath the waves. Suddenly, they found themselves in a tiny boat in the middle of the South Atlantic, over 1,000 miles from the nearest land, with almost no food and no water. Richard Parker, who had started this voyage as an excited 17-year-old embarking on his first real adventure, was now facing a situation that would test the very limits of human endurance and morality. As dawn broke on July 6th, the reality of their situation became clear. They were completely alone in a vast ocean, with supplies that might last a few days at most. The nearest shipping lanes were hundreds of miles away, and their chances of being spotted by a passing vessel were virtually non-existent. What had begun as a routine delivery voyage had become a fight for survival that would push 4 decent men to make unthinkable choices. What do you think about their situation so far? Can you imagine being trapped in a small boat in the middle of the ocean with almost no supplies? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what happens next will test everything you believe about right and wrong. The first few days in the lifeboat gave the 4 survivors hope that they might be rescued quickly. Ships did pass through these waters, and surely someone would spot their small craft and come to their aid. Captain Dudley tried to maintain morale by establishing routines and rationing their meager supplies as carefully as possible. The 2 tins of turnips were divided into tiny portions, barely enough to keep them alive, and they began the agonizing wait for rescue. But as days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, the horrible reality of their situation became undeniable. They were not in a major shipping lane, and the vastness of the ocean made the chances of being spotted almost impossibly remote. The psychological pressure of their situation began to take its toll on all four men, but it was particularly devastating for young Richard Parker. The physical challenges were overwhelming from the very beginning. The 13-foot lifeboat offered no protection from the elements. During the day, the tropical sun beat down mercilessly, causing severe sunburn and dehydration. At night they shivered in the cold, huddled together for warmth but never able to sleep properly. Their skin became cracked and painful, their lips split and bleeding from the constant exposure to salt spray. But it was the thirst that dominated everything. The human body can survive for weeks without food, but only days without fresh water. By the end of the first week, their tongues were swollen, their throats felt like sandpaper, and their urine had become dark and concentrated. They tried desperately to collect rainwater when possible, but the few drops they managed to gather were barely enough to wet their lips. Richard, being the youngest and smallest, seemed to suffer more acutely than the others. His body had fewer reserves to draw upon, and the psychological pressure of the situation was almost overwhelming for someone who had never faced anything more challenging than dock work in Southampton. He began to weaken noticeably, becoming listless and barely able to help with the basic tasks of survival. By the second week, desperation drove them to make their first compromise with civilized behavior. Following the age-old custom of survivors at sea, they began drinking their own urine. It was revolting and provided little real relief, but it contained water that their bodies had not yet processed, and every drop was precious. Richard found this particularly difficult, often vomiting up the bitter liquid which only made his condition worse. The lack of food was equally devastating. The tiny portions of turnips were consumed within the first week, leaving them with nothing but the hope of catching rain or somehow finding other sustenance. They tried fishing with improvised hooks made from buttons and bits of metal, but without proper bait or equipment, their efforts were futile. The ocean teemed with life, but it remained tantalizingly out of reach. As the third week began, the men's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically. They had lost significant weight, their skin hung loose on their frames, and their strength was failing rapidly. More disturbing were the psychological changes. The constant stress, dehydration, and starvation were affecting their mental state, leading to periods of confusion, hallucinations, and irrational behavior. Richard Parker's condition was particularly alarming. The young man who had been so enthusiastic and optimistic was now barely conscious much of the time. He would drift in and out of delirium, sometimes calling out for his friends back in Southampton, sometimes just lying motionless in the bottom of the boat. His breathing became labored, and it was clear that he was failing faster than the others. Captain Dudley and Edwin Stevens began having quiet conversations that Edmund Brooks tried not to overhear. They spoke in whispers about their dwindling chances of rescue and the horrible calculations of survival. With Richard clearly the weakest, and with no family or dependents waiting for him back in England, a terrible logic was beginning to form in their desperate minds. The discussions grew more explicit as Richard's condition worsened. They talked about the customs of the sea, about survival situations where desperate measures had been taken. They spoke about their own families. Dudley had a wife and children waiting for him. Stevens had dependents who needed him to return. Richard, as tragic as it was, had no one who would suffer if he didn't make it home. Thank you so much for staying with us through this incredible and disturbing story. I know these details are difficult to hear, but they show the extreme situations that can push human beings beyond all moral boundaries. The most shocking part of this story is still coming, so please don't leave us now. By July 24th, 18 days after the Mignonette sank, Richard Parker was barely clinging to life. He had not eaten in days and could barely swallow water. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak, and it seemed clear to everyone in the boat that he was dying. It was then that Captain Dudley made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and create one of the most controversial legal cases in history. July 25th, 1884, dawned gray and overcast, with no sign of rescue on the horizon. It had been 20 days since the Mignonette went down, and the four survivors were barely alive. Richard Parker lay unconscious in the bottom of the boat, his breathing so shallow that it was sometimes difficult to tell if he was still alive. His body had wasted away to perhaps 90 pounds, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor of someone very close to death. Captain Tom Dudley and Edwin Stevens had spent the night in whispered conversation, discussing what they both knew had to be done, but neither wanted to voice aloud. They had reached the point where continuing to wait for rescue meant that all four of them would die. Richard was clearly beyond saving, even if rescue came immediately. His condition was so severe that survival seemed impossible. Edmund Brooks, the navigator, had tried to distance himself from these conversations, but he understood the terrible logic his companions were following. In their desperate state, with death seemingly inevitable for all of them, the awful arithmetic of survival was becoming clear. Richard Parker was going to die anyway, and his death might provide the sustenance needed to keep the others alive long enough for rescue. The decision, when it finally came, was not made in a moment of madness or sudden desperation. It was the result of days of agonizing deliberation, of weighing the value of human life against the instinct for survival, of trying to find some moral justification for what they knew was fundamentally wrong, but seemed necessary for their survival. Captain Dudley later testified that he prayed before making his decision. He asked God for forgiveness and for guidance, but ultimately concluded that sacrificing one life to save three was the lesser of two evils. He convinced himself that Richard was going to die regardless, and that allowing his death to serve some purpose was better than watching all four of them perish uselessly. Around midday on July 25th, with Richard Parker still unconscious and barely breathing, Captain Dudley took out his pocket knife and made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Edwin Stevens held the dying boy while Dudley, with tears streaming down his face, cut Richard's throat. The act was over in seconds, but its consequences would reverberate for decades. The immediate aftermath was both practical and horrific. The three survivors collected Richard's blood in whatever containers they could find, drinking it immediately to combat their severe dehydration. Then, using Dudley's knife, they began the grisly process of preparing the body for food. They removed organs, cut the flesh into portions, and began the awful business of consuming their former crewmate. The psychological impact of their actions was immediate and devastating. All three men wept as they ate, knowing that they had crossed a line that separated civilized humans from animals. They prayed before each meal, asking forgiveness for their actions, while simultaneously knowing that those same actions might be what saved their lives. Edmund Brooks, who had not participated in the actual killing, struggled with his own complicity. He had not stopped his companions, and he consumed his share of the flesh, making him an accomplice to what was clearly murder by any legal definition. His later testimony revealed the deep psychological trauma that the experience caused him. The meat from Richard Parker's body sustained the three survivors for the next 4 days. They were careful to preserve as much as possible, knowing that they might need it to survive until rescue came. The psychological effects of cannibalism were severe. Nightmares, hallucinations, and a profound sense of guilt that would haunt all three men for the rest of their lives. On July 29, 4 days after Richard Parker's death, their prayers were finally answered. The German ship Montezuma spotted the tiny lifeboat and rescued the three survivors. They were in terrible condition, emaciated, sunburned, and clearly traumatized. But they were alive. Richard Parker's sacrifice, willing or not, had served its purpose. The rescue should have been the end of their ordeal, but in many ways, it was just the beginning. As they recovered aboard the Montezuma, the three survivors had to decide what they would tell the authorities about what had happened during those 24 days adrift. The truth was too horrible to contemplate sharing, but the lies they might tell would eventually unravel under investigation. Captain Dudley, in what would prove to be a fateful decision, chose to tell the truth. He believed that any reasonable person would understand that they had faced an impossible situation and made the only choice that allowed anyone to survive. He could not have imagined that his honesty would lead to a legal case that would challenge the very foundations of maritime law and moral philosophy. When the Montezuma docked in Falmouth, England on September 6, 1884, the three survivors of the Mignonette, expected to be treated as heroes who had overcome incredible odds to survive a maritime disaster. Instead, their honest account of what had happened during those 24 days adrift would launch one of the most controversial legal cases in British history. Captain Tom Dudley's decision to tell the truth about Richard Parker's death was driven by his belief that any reasonable person would understand their impossible situation. Maritime tradition and the unwritten law of the sea had long recognized that desperate measures might be necessary for survival. Surely, he thought, the authorities would see that they had faced a choice between letting all 4 men die or sacrificing one to save 3. But the legal system in 1884, Britain was not prepared to accept such reasoning. When Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks gave their statements to the harbor authorities in Falmouth, the officials were shocked by what they heard. This was not a case of accidental death or natural disaster. This was a deliberate killing, regardless of the circumstances. The 3 men were immediately arrested and charged with murder. The case of Regina v. Dudley and Stevens became a sensation in the British press. Newspapers across the country covered every detail of the story, from Richard Parker's humble origins as a Southampton orphan to the grisly details of his death and consumption. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw the survivors as murderers who had committed an unforgivable act, while others viewed them as desperate men who had made an impossible choice in extraordinary circumstances. The legal arguments were equally complex. The prosecution, led by the Crown, argued that murder was murder regardless of circumstances. The law could not recognize necessity as a defense for taking human life, because to do so would open the door to all manner of violence justified by claims of desperation. If people could kill others to save themselves, the very foundation of civilized society would crumble. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the case represented a situation so extreme and unusual that normal legal standards could not apply. They pointed to centuries of maritime tradition that recognized the harsh realities of survival at sea. They argued that Richard Parker was going to die anyway, and that his death served to preserve 3 other lives that might otherwise have been lost. The trial revealed disturbing details about the decision-making process aboard the lifeboat. Evidence showed that the survivors had not drawn lots to determine who would die, as was sometimes done in such desperate situations. Instead, they had specifically chosen Richard Parker because he was the weakest, had no family, and was unlikely to survive anyway. This calculated selection made their actions seem more like premeditated murder than desperate survival. Dr. William Bryson, who examined the survivors after their rescue, testified about their physical condition and the medical realities of their situation. He confirmed that all 4 men were near death from starvation and dehydration, and that Richard Parker's condition was indeed the most critical. However, he could not say with certainty that the boy would have died without intervention. The psychological testimony was equally compelling. All 3 survivors showed signs of severe trauma from their experience. They suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, and profound guilt about their actions. Edmund Brooks, in particular, seemed haunted by his failure to prevent the killing, even though he understood the desperate circumstances that led to it. The trial also explored the broader implications of the case for maritime law and moral philosophy. If necessity could be accepted as a defense for murder, what other extreme situations might justify taking human life? Where would society draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable survival behavior? Legal scholars debated whether there was any meaningful difference between actively killing someone for survival and passively allowing them to die. They discussed the moral implications of selecting a victim based on perceived social value or likelihood of survival. These questions had no easy answers, but they had to be addressed by a legal system trying to create consistent and just standards. On December 9, 1884, the court reached its verdict. Tom Dudley and Edwin Stevens were found guilty of murder, but with a strong recommendation for mercy given the extraordinary circumstances of their case. Edmund Brooks was acquitted, as he had not participated directly in the killing. The guilty verdict established the legal principle that necessity cannot be a defense for murder, a precedent that remains in effect today. However, recognizing the unique circumstances and the public sympathy for the survivors, Queen Victoria commuted their death sentences to 6 months in prison. They served their time quietly and were released to rebuild their lives as best they could. Both men were forever changed by their experience and the legal ordeal that followed. The case established important legal precedents that continue to influence courts around the world. It clarified that human life cannot be sacrificed for utilitarian calculations, even in the most desperate circumstances. It also recognized, through the mercy shown to the defendants, that extreme situations can mitigate the moral culpability of actions that would normally be unforgivable. Richard Parker's grave in Southampton bears a simple inscription remembering him as a victim of maritime disaster. But his death created a legacy far beyond what anyone could have imagined, a legal precedent that continues to shape how society balances individual survival against collective moral standards. The case of Richard Parker and the survivors of the Mignonette forces us to confront one of the most difficult questions in human ethics. When, if ever, is it acceptable to sacrifice one life to save others? The 3 men who killed and consumed their 17-year-old crewmate were not monsters. They were ordinary people pushed to extraordinary extremes by circumstances beyond their control. Tom Dudley spent the rest of his life haunted by his decision. He never captained another ship and struggled with depression and alcoholism. Edwin Stevens also found it difficult to return to normal life, eventually emigrating to Australia, where he hoped to escape the notoriety of the case. Edmund Brooks, though legally acquitted, carried the psychological burden of his survival for the rest of his days. The legal precedent established by their case, that necessity cannot justify murder, remains controversial even today. Legal scholars continue to debate whether the court reached the right conclusion, and whether there might be extreme circumstances where the law should recognize the terrible choices that survival sometimes demands. Perhaps most tragically, we will never know what Richard Parker himself would have chosen if he had been conscious and able to participate in the decision. Would this brave young man, who had worked so hard to build a life for himself, have willingly sacrificed himself to save his crewmates? Or would he have fought for his own survival with the same determination that had carried him through years of poverty and hardship? What do you think about this incredible case? Do you believe Tom Dudley and Edwin Stevens were murderers who deserved punishment, or desperate men who made an impossible choice in unthinkable circumstances? Was the court right to establish that human life can never be sacrificed for utilitarian calculations, even when facing certain death? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This case has been debated for over a century, and we want to hear your perspective on one of the most challenging moral dilemmas in human history. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as we did, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you the most incredible and controversial true stories from history, examining the moments when ordinary people face extraordinary moral choices. Make sure you watch our next recommended video about the Donner Party, another case where desperate hunger drove people to unthinkable acts of survival. It's a story that will challenge your understanding of human nature and the lengths people will go to stay alive. Thank you for joining us for this difficult but important journey into one of the most controversial cases in legal history. The story of Richard Parker reminds us that the line between civilization and survival is often thinner than we like to imagine, and that moral judgments become infinitely more complex when viewed through the lens of desperation and the will to live.